Some men crumble when their wives cheat. Me? I make sure they regret it. My name is Randall Baldwin. 58 years old, 30 years in homicide. Now semi-retired, but not by choice. The force didn't want guys like me hanging around too long. Too much baggage. Too many cases that never got closed. I live in Tucson, Arizona, in a house that should have been bulldozed 10 years ago. Instead, I keep it standing with stubbornness and duct tape. The air here is dry, the nights are long, and a man like me doesn't sleep easy. Colleen used to be the kind of woman who lit up a room. That was a long time ago. Lately, she's been different. Distracted, always checking her phone, laughing a little too hard at jokes I wasn't telling. People think a cop stops being a cop when he hangs up his badge. They're wrong. I've spent 3 decades knowing when someone's lying. The way they blink too much, the pause before they answer, the little nervous habits they don't even know they have. One night, I watched her sit on the couch, pretending to scroll through emails while her thumb hovered over the screen. She laughed, short, nervous, then glanced up like she'd forgotten I was there. "Something funny?" I asked. She locked the phone and set it face down on the table. "Just a stupid meme from work." I nodded, didn't press. Instead, I took a slow sip of my beer, letting the silence stretch. Colleen never used to need noise to fill a room. Now, she was shifting in her seat, tapping her fingers against the armrest. Guilt had a rhythm, and I could hear it loud and clear. I started watching her closer after that. Subtle things. Long showers when she got home. Too long for someone who wasn't washing off more than a workday. Perfume on a Tuesday. Colleen never wore perfume unless she had a reason. And then there were the car rides. She'd leave, say she was running errands, but I'd track her on my old GPS app, circling the same damn block for 10 minutes before finally parking in front of some rundown bar. A man gets 2 choices when he finds out his wife is cheating. He can break, or he can get to work. I chose the latter. I called Mike Harlow my handyman. The guy was built like a tree trunk, wore the same damn tool belt every day, and had a way of getting straight to the point. "She's running around on you," he said after I gave him the rundown. "You want to know for sure, or you want to get even?" "Both," I said. Mike nodded like that was the only acceptable answer. "All right, let's get you some proof." Proof wasn't hard to get. People think affairs are complex, full of deep secrets and careful planning. They aren't. They're sloppy. People get lazy when they think no one's looking. A little recorder under the passenger seat, a few extra eyes in the right places, and within a week, I had everything I needed. Tuesday night, 8:47 p.m., Colleen's car was parked outside the Rusty Nail, a hole-in-the-wall joint that smelled like spilled beer and desperation. I sat across the street, engine off, watching through the windshield as she walked in. 10 minutes later, he arrived. Dean Carver, the physical therapist. Clean-cut, soft-spoken. The kind of guy who probably smelled like eucalyptus and told people to breathe through the pain. He wasn't impressive, but Colleen looked at him like he was. They didn't touch at first. Just sat at a corner booth, leaning in close, whispering. Colleen laughed, different from the fake laughs she'd been giving me. This one was real. That was the part that got me. Not the affair. Not the lies. The laughter. Like she had something with this guy that I hadn't heard in years. I gripped the steering wheel, jaw tight. Didn't let myself feel it. Feeling was for suckers. After an hour, they left together. No hesitation, no sneaking glances. Just 2 people heading toward the motel across the street like they owned the damn place. I didn't follow. Didn't need to. I already knew how this story ended. I sat there for another 10 minutes, letting the weight of it settle. Then, I pulled out my phone and dialed Joe Dalton. Joe and I went through the trenches together. 30 years in homicide, more sleepless nights than I could count. He retired a couple of years before me, but we still talked. "Randall," he answered, voice scratchy. "Hell of a time to call." "She's cheating," I said. No fluff, no lead-up. Joe let out a slow exhale. "You sure?" "Yeah." "You drunk?" "Not yet." "Good. You planning on doing anything stupid?" I looked back at the motel. The lights in one of the second-floor rooms flickered on. Define stupid. Joe sighed. "Whatever you're thinking, take a night. Think twice. Then do it." I didn't answer. Just ended the call and put the truck in gear. Tomorrow, I'd get even. The next morning, I was up before the sun, sitting at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee and a legal pad. Years of solving murders had taught me one thing. Justice wasn't about feelings. It was about evidence, timing, and making sure the guilty had nowhere to run. I wasn't about to waste time with a screaming match or some half-assed confrontation where Colleen cried, and I pretended to be surprised. No, she was going to feel this. By the time the first light bled through the window, I had a plan. I wasn't going to take her aside like some wounded husband looking for an explanation. I was going to end this in front of an audience. Colleen didn't mind making a fool out of me behind closed doors. Let's see how she liked it when the lights were on. Mike showed up just after 8, toolbox in one hand, a thermos in the other. He let himself in, gave me a once-over. You look like you've been up all night. I poured him coffee, let him sit before I spoke. I want it public. He took a slow sip, nodded. All right. How public? Parents. Friends. Her whole goddamn support system. Mike let out a low whistle. You sure you want to burn it all down at once? It's already burned, I said. She just doesn't know it yet. I set the trap that afternoon. A dinner. A big one. I told Colleen we should invite her parents, Dean's wife, and a few of our closest friends. Said it was time to reconnect. She hesitated, guilt making her cautious, but then she smiled, nodded. That's a great idea, Randall. I looked right at her. I know. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next couple of days were a waiting game. Colleen went about her routine, acting like everything was fine. She didn't know I had all the proof I needed, text logs, photos, even a recording of her whispering sweet nothings into Dean's ear while she sat parked in a grocery store lot. The longer I watched her pretend, the more I realized something. She wasn't nervous. She was relieved. She thought she had me fooled. The night of the dinner, I made sure everything was perfect. Set the table. Bought the best cut of steak. Colleen spent the afternoon humming as she cooked, a little too eager, like playing hostess was enough to wipe away months of betrayal. I let her. People started arriving just after 6. Colleen's parents, both old-fashioned, church-going types who still thought we were the perfect couple. Dean's wife, a quiet woman who looked tired even before she stepped through the door. A couple of our mutual friends, people Colleen had confided in, no doubt, spinning her own version of things. I played my part well. Poured drinks, made small talk, kept my face unreadable. Colleen was glowing, nervous energy spilling out of her in quick laughs and over-explained stories. She thought tonight was about new beginnings. It was, just not for her. Halfway through dinner, I cleared my throat, set my fork down. The room quieted. Colleen glanced at me, smiling, still completely blind. I reached under the table, pulled out the manila folder, and dropped it right in front of her. Colleen, I said, voice steady. Why don't you tell everyone what you've been up to? The blood drained from her face. Randall, what? I flipped the folder open. The first thing on top was a photo, her and Dean, hand in hand, walking into a motel. Then the screenshots, the call logs. The room went dead silent. Colleen's mother gasped. Her father went rigid, jaw clenched. Across the table, Dean's wife stared, her face blank, like her brain refused to catch up to what she was seeing. Colleen swallowed hard, reached out like she could make it all disappear. Randall, let's not do this here. This is exactly where we do it, I said. You didn't mind lying in front of these people. Now you're going to face them. Dean shifted in his seat, eyes darting for the exit. I think we should. Shut the hell up, Dean. His wife turned to him, her face unreadable. It's true. Dean opened his mouth, closed it again. That was enough of an answer. Colleen's father shoved his chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. Jesus Christ, Colleen. Her mother was already crying. I watched Colleen shrink, her confidence evaporating. No fake laughs now. No excuses left to grab onto. Just silence and judgment, the weight of every lie pressing down on her shoulders. She looked at me, pleading. Randall, we can talk about this. We can work through it. I leaned back, arms crossed. We? Colleen, there hasn't been a we in a long time. You made sure of that. She reached for my hand. I didn't move. I was lonely, she whispered, eyes wet now. You shut me out. I scoffed. Don't pin this on me. You had a problem? You talk. You don't crawl into another man's bed and expect a pat on the back. Dean's wife stood abruptly, pushing her chair back. She turned to him, voice shaking but firm. We're done. Dean reached for her. Babe. She didn't let him finish. She grabbed her purse and walked out. Colleen turned to her parents, but they wouldn't look at her. I think you should leave, her father said, his voice heavy. Colleen blinked. Dad, you heard me. That was it. No big explosion, no screaming match. Just a quiet, irreversible truth sinking into her bones. I stood, pushing my chair back. This marriage is over, Colleen. I nodded toward the folder. Lawyer's info is in there. We're done. Colleen's lips trembled. Randall, please. I walked past her, grabbed my coat, and didn't look back. I'd spent my life solving other people's crimes. Tonight, I finally got justice for my own. I left the house without looking back, the cool desert air hitting me like a slap. The street was quiet except for the sound of my boots on pavement. Across the way, Mrs. Jenkins, my elderly neighbor, was standing on her porch wrapped in one of those knitted shawls she always wore, her sharp eyes watching. You all right, Randall? She called, voice thin but steady. I stopped at the end of my driveway, lit a cigarette, exhaled slow. Yeah, Margaret. Just took out the trash. She nodded like she understood more than I was saying. Good. That bin was starting to stink. I gave her a small nod and kept walking. I didn't need to tell her anything. She'd already seen enough in her years to put two and two together. The truck door creaked as I climbed in, the leather seat stiff from age. I sat for a minute, watching my hands on the steering wheel. They weren't shaking. That was something. I wasn't heading home. Not yet. I needed somewhere else, somewhere to let the night settle without the weight of four walls pressing in. I pulled onto the highway and drove without thinking, let the road make the decision for me. I ended up at Dalton's place, just outside of town, a modest house with a wraparound porch and a fridge that never ran out of beer. He was already outside when I pulled up, a bottle in one hand, the other resting on his old dog's head. You look like a man who just buried a body, he said, watching me over the rim of his beer. Not yet, I said, grabbing a bottle from the cooler by his chair. But the night's young. I sat heavy in the chair across from him, took a long pull from the bottle. The dog, an old mutt with a bad leg, sniffed at my boots and then flopped down with a sigh. Dalton didn't ask. He just let the silence stretch, gave me space to fill it on my own time. That was the thing about men like us. Words were secondary. She's done, I finally said. Made sure of it tonight. He nodded, took another sip. Messy. Controlled. Good. He leaned back, his chair creaking. What's next? I exhaled, flicked ash off the side of the porch. Divorce, settlement, making sure she doesn't walk away with a dime she doesn't deserve. And the guy? Already handled. Dalton gave me a side glance, then chuckled. You always were thorough. I didn't respond, just watched the horizon where the city lights met the dark. A long time ago, I used to believe in justice, and things balancing out the way they were supposed to. The job beat that out of me. Justice wasn't automatic. It had to be forced into place by men willing to do what needed doing. Dalton studied me for a moment, then reached over and knocked the top of my bottle with his own. To clean breaks. I clinked his bottle out of habit, but the words sat in my chest. There was no such thing as a clean break. There was just the break. And whatever came after. I left his place a little after midnight, driving slow through the empty streets, letting the hum of the engine settle something inside me. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light Colleen always left on. It was funny. She still had enough routine left in her to do that, even knowing I wouldn't be walking back inside. I didn't go in. Instead, I grabbed a duffel bag from the back of the truck and headed for the old storage shed I'd converted into a workspace. The house wasn't my home anymore. It was just a building I hadn't officially signed away yet. Inside the shed, the air smelled like sawdust and motor oil. Tools lined the pegboard, neatly arranged the way I liked them. A half-finished project, an old chair I'd meant to repair, sat in the center of the room. I hadn't touched it in months. I set my bag down, grabbed a rag, and started wiping the dust off the chair. Hands needed work. Mind needed focus. I'd let Colleen steal too much of my time already. The next few days were methodical. I called the lawyer first thing, set the wheels in motion. Colleen called me 3 times. I didn't pick up. She sent a text on the 4th try. Colleen, can we just talk? I stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed my response. Me, we already did. Then I blocked her number. I spent the rest of the day getting the house in order. Not for her, not for me, but because I wasn't about to leave a damn thing behind when I walked away from this mess. Mike came by around noon, tools slung over his shoulder. You need something fixed or just company? I gestured to the back fence, thinking about tearing it down, replacing it. He squinted at it, nodding. That time of year? Huh? Something like that. He dropped his bag and got to work without another word. That was the thing about Mike. He didn't do sympathy, didn't do big speeches. Just worked. And that was what I needed. By sundown, the fence was halfway gone, splintered boards stacked to the side. I wiped sweat from my forehead, leaned against the post, and looked at the open space. Feels better already, Mike muttered, cracking his knuckles. I nodded. Yeah, it does. Colleen was out of my life. The past was deadwood, and I was already tearing it down. The fence was gone by the next afternoon. The backyard felt bigger without it, open in a way I wasn't used to. Funny how something meant to keep things and could make a place feel smaller. Mike packed up his tools, wiping the back of his neck with an old rag. You figure out what you're doing with the house yet? He asked, tossing a stray nail into the toolbox. I leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed. Not keeping it. That's for damn sure. Good. Last thing you need is a constant reminder every time you walk through the front door. He picked up his thermos, took a long drink. Market's decent. Sell it, take the money, start fresh. Yeah. I nodded, but the idea of starting fresh at 58 wasn't something I'd thought about until now. The house was never really a home, just a place to put my boots at the end of the day. Colleen had made it look like something it wasn't. Without her, it was just empty walls and old regrets. Mike tossed his rag over his shoulder. You sticking around tonight? Are you heading out? Why? I asked, narrowing my eyes. Because Dalton's wife called my sister. Said he's been in a mood. I figure that means he's either sitting on his porch drinking too much or he's halfway through a bottle in his garage, talking to his dog about the state of the world. I exhaled, shaking my head. Damn idiot never could handle sitting still. That's what I said. Mike slapped the lid on his toolbox. Go check on him. I'd do it myself, but I got a busted sink to fix and an ex-wife who still thinks I care about what color she paints the kitchen. I didn't argue. Dalton had been through enough, same as me. His wife passed 2 years back, and ever since then, he'd been floating. Some days were good. Others, not so much. I knew better than anyone what loneliness could do to a man. By the time I pulled up to Dalton's place, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. His truck was there, parked crooked, like he'd pulled in without thinking about it. The front porch light was on, and the screen door was cracked open. I didn't knock. Inside, the house was the same as always, dark wood furniture, old police commendations on the wall, the faint smell of bourbon hanging in the air. Dalton was in the kitchen, bottle in front of him, one glass half full. His mutt, Lucky, lay curled at his feet, tail thumping once when he saw me. You here to babysit? Dalton asked without looking up. Nope. Just came to drink your liquor. He grunted, slid the bottle across the table. Help yourself. I poured a glass, took a slow sip, let the burn settle before speaking. Mike says you've been in a mood. Mike should mind his own damn business. He does. Until you start acting like an idiot. Dalton finally looked at me, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight. You think I don't know that? You think I don't wake up every day and know I'm sitting in a house too big for one man and a dog? I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. He wasn't looking for an answer, just a place to throw his words. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I hear you dropped the hammer on Colleen. Did what needed to be done. A slow nod. She take it bad? She took it exactly like a woman who thought she'd never get caught. Dalton let out something between a laugh and a sigh. They always think that, don't they? They do. Silence stretched between us. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just there. He took another sip, stared at nothing in particular. You ever think about what comes next? Not really. Maybe you should. I leaned back, watching him. That what you've been doing? Thinking about what's next? He smirked, shaking his head. Nah. Just wondering if it matters. I took another sip, let the liquor sit on my tongue before swallowing. It does. Even when it doesn't feel like it. He grunted, set his glass down. All right, enough of this shit. You want to help me or not? Help you with what? He stood, stretched, grabbed his coat. We're getting dinner. And not from some damn drive-thru. Put your boots on. I frowned but didn't argue. I was hungry, and Dalton wasn't the kind of man you said no to when he had that look in his eye. We ended up at a steakhouse on the edge of town, one of those places with dark booths and waitresses who called you Han, whether they meant it or not. We ordered big porterhouses, baked potatoes, extra butter. Dalton was already halfway through his second beer when he looked at me and smirked. You ever think about going back to work? I stabbed a piece of steak, chewed slow. Not in the mood for small talk? Not in the mood for retirement. You're retired. You get to sit around and do nothing. That was the whole point. He scoffed. Yeah, well, sitting around isn't all it's cracked up to be. I miss the job. I did too. But I wasn't about to admit it. You miss the paychecks. I miss the work. I miss having something to sink my teeth into. I couldn't argue with that. Chasing down murderers and solving cases had been more than a job. It had been a purpose. Without it, things felt still. Too still. Dalton sipped his beer, watching me. I got a guy. Private security firm. Pays well, keeps you busy. You'd be good at it. Babysitting corporate assholes doesn't sound like my kind of work. That's not what it is. It's problem solving. Strategy. Helping people who don't have the brains to help themselves. I set my fork down, considering. You already sign up? Not yet. But I'm thinking about it. I exhaled, watching the condensation on my beer glass. The idea of working again, of having something to put my mind to, wasn't the worst one I'd heard. Dalton leaned back, stretching. Just think about it. Beat spending the rest of your life tearing down fences. I smirked. You didn't seem to mind watching me work. Hell no, it was the most entertainment I've had in months. The waitress dropped the check, and Dalton grabbed it before I could. I didn't argue. He'd earned it. As we walked back to the truck, the air had cooled, the sky clear and full of stars. I shoved my hands in my pockets, glancing at him. If I say no, you gonna keep nagging me about it? Like an ex-wife. Christ. He laughed, opening the truck door. See? I already gave you something to think about. I didn't respond. Just climbed in, started the engine, and pulled out onto the road. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to think about what came next. 2 weeks passed. Colleen moved out. The house was quiet in a way I hadn't realized it hadn't been in years. No forced conversations, no fake laughter, no trying to figure out what version of my wife I was going to get that day. Just silence. The kind I could live with. The divorce was moving along faster than expected. Colleen didn't have the nerve to fight me in court. The evidence I had made sure of that. Her lawyer tried, of course. Some half-assed attempt at negotiating, asking if we could split things more amicably. I sat across the table from Colleen and her lawyer, arms folded. Colleen, you spent months sneaking around behind my back, lying straight to my face. The only reason I'm not dragging this through a courtroom is because I don't feel like wasting my time. Take what I'm offering or take nothing. Up to you. Her lawyer glanced at her, waiting for a cue. Colleen swallowed, looked down at the papers. I could see it in her eyes. She knew she had no ground to stand on. Knew she'd already lost. She signed. I walked out without looking back. That night, I sat on the back porch with a beer, watching the moon rise over the desert. The fence was still gone, the open space stretching further than it had before. The house wasn't home anymore. Maybe it never was. Mike came by the next morning, found me in the shed, oiling a stubborn hinge on the old storage cabinet. He leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. So, you gonna tell me what you're doing now that you're free? Or do I have to pull it out of you? Thinking about selling the house, I said, not looking up. He whistled low. Didn't think you'd go that far. Nothing left here, I muttered, wiping grease off my hands. Not for me, anyway. Mike studied me for a second, then nodded. Good. I'd have told you the same thing. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, tossed it onto the workbench. Dalton's guy. Security firm. Pays well. He said he's meeting with them next week. I glanced at the paper, then back at him. You in on this too? Maybe. Work steady, and my ex is still trying to bleed me dry. I smirked. I thought you liked fixing sinks for old ladies. Not as much as I like a steady paycheck, he said, rubbing his jaw. Plus, I figure you could use a partner who's not just an old drunk in a rocking chair. I picked up the paper, read the name at the top. Lone Star Risk Solutions. Private security, investigations, corporate contracts. Not police work, not exactly, but not far from it, either. Mike watched me. Look, man, you can keep fixing hinges and pretending like you don't miss the chase, or you can take this and put your brain to use again. Your call. I set the paper down, exhaled through my nose. You always this pushy? Only when I'm right. I left the paper on the workbench, but the idea stuck with me all day. That night, I took a drive. Not to anywhere in particular, just to put miles between me and the house, let the road untangle my thoughts. I ended up downtown, near an old bookstore that had somehow survived the slow death of brick-and-mortar retail. I stepped inside, the bell overhead jingling. The place smelled like paper and dust, the kind of smell that belonged to quiet spaces. There were only a couple of people inside, a kid flipping through a comic, an older man nodding off in a chair. Behind the counter, a woman looked up from a ledger. Mid to late 40s, sharp features, dark hair pulled back, reading glasses balanced on the tip of her nose. She studied me the way people in small businesses studied strangers, curious but cautious. Help you find something? She asked. Just looking, I said, scanning the shelves. She nodded, went back to her book. I wandered, fingers brushing over worn spines, half reading titles without taking them in. Eventually, I stopped near a section marked True Crime. That's an interesting choice, the woman said, watching me from over her glasses. I turned, eyebrow raised. How so? Most people don't browse true crime unless they have a reason, she said. Either they're fascinated by it, or they've lived it. I smirked. Guess which one I am? She tilted her head, giving me another once-over. Lived it. Good guess. Wasn't a guess. She closed her book, leaning against the counter. Cop. Used to be. She nodded, like that made sense. That why you're here? Looking for something to fill the gap? Something like that. She considered me for a moment, then extended a hand. Marissa Gentry. Owner. I shook it. Randall Baldwin. Former homicide. She smirked. Figured. I glanced around the store, taking in the old shelves, the faint sound of jazz playing from a back room. Nice place you got. It pays the bills, she said, then narrowed her eyes. You drink coffee, Baldwin? Strong and black. Good. Sit tight. She disappeared into the back, leaving me standing in the middle of the shop, surrounded by stories about things worse than divorce. For the first time in a while, I wasn't thinking about Colleen, wasn't thinking about what she did, or the house I was about to leave behind. I was thinking about what came next. Marissa came back a few minutes later, 2 cups in hand, steam curling off the top. She slid one across the counter and leaned against it, studying me like she was still trying to figure something out. Let me guess, she said, blowing on her coffee. Retired, but not by choice. Wife cheated, took her shot at the bank account, but you saw it coming. Now you're standing in a bookstore at 9 at night, trying to decide what the hell to do with yourself. I smirked, taking a sip. Coffee was strong. No sugar, no nonsense. You always this good at reading people? Only when they're not trying to hide. I glanced around the shop, the dim lighting, the way everything had a place. You own this place alone? Yeah. She set her cup down, crossing her arms. Husband passed 8 years ago. Cancer. Left me the store. Figured I'd keep it going, see if I could outlast Amazon. How's that working out? She smiled, just a little. Some days are better than others. I nodded, leaning against a shelf. I get that. Silence settled, but it wasn't uncomfortable. She took another sip of coffee, watching me over the rim of her cup. You thinking about sticking around town? Not sure yet. Got a job offer, just not sure I want it. She tilted her head. Doing what? Private security. Risk assessment. The usual corporate bullshit. You'd be good at it. I raised an eyebrow. You don't even know me. I know the type. You like solving problems. You like being useful. She wasn't wrong, but I didn't confirm it. The door chimed as the kid with the comic left, stuffing the book under his arm. The old man in the corner snored softly. Marissa studied me for another beat, then nodded toward the coffee in my hand. Well, Baldwin, if you decide to stick around, the coffee's free for regulars. That right? Yeah, but you actually have to buy a book every once in a while. I smirked. Guess I better find something worth reading. She just shook her head, picking up her ledger again. Take your time. Store's not going anywhere. I finished my coffee, left a 20 on the counter, and walked out with a book I wasn't sure I'd read. The next morning, I called Dalton. You still meeting with that security firm? I asked. He let out a gruff chuckle. Knew you'd come around. Yeah, tomorrow at noon. You in? I'll be there. Mike wasn't surprised when I told him. Just grinned over his coffee like he knew it was coming. Told you you'd get bored. I ignored him, flipping through the file Dalton had sent over. Lone Star Risk Solutions. High-end security consulting. Discreet, high-paying clients who needed problems solved without making a mess. It wasn't police work, but it was close enough. I spent the day clearing out the house, packing up what little was mine. The place felt less like a home with every box that got taped shut. By evening, it was just bare walls and memories I didn't care to keep. Colleen hadn't called. She wouldn't. She knew better. Mike stopped by with a 6-pack, sat on the porch steps, and cracked one open. So, where you headed after you sell this place? Not sure yet, I admitted. Might stick around for a bit, see how this job turns out. He nodded, taking a long sip. Good. Tucson's not the worst place to start over. I wasn't sure about that. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking behind me. And that was something. The office at Lone Star Risk Solutions was exactly what I expected. Clean, quiet, no wasted space. Dalton and I sat across from the guy running the show, a former Army colonel named Walker. Built like a brick wall, voice like gravel, the kind of man who didn't waste words. He skimmed through my file, nodding like he already knew what he was going to say. 30 years in homicide. Good record. No bullshit. You solve problems, Baldwin? I met his gaze. I end them. That got a grin. That's what we need. We shook on it. Contract signed. No ceremony. No long speeches. Just a job that needed doing and a man willing to do it. 2 weeks later, Colleen was officially out of my life. The house sold faster than expected. Some out-of-state buyer who didn't give a damn about its history. Fine by me. The check hit my account, and just like that, there was nothing left tying me down. Word got around about what happened. Small towns had long memories. Colleen wasn't exactly the victim she thought she'd be. Last I heard, Dean's wife took him to court, cleaned him out. His practice took a hit, lost clients, lost reputation. Some people can bounce back from that. He wasn't one of them. I ran into Colleen's father once, outside the hardware store. He didn't say much, just gave me a nod and a solid pat on the shoulder. You did right, son, he said. She needed to learn. Didn't say I agreed. Didn't say I didn't. Just nodded back and walked inside. Mrs. Jenkins waved me down a few days later, stopping me in the street. Saw a moving truck outside your place. You leaving for good? Looks that way. She gave a slow nod, then squinted up at me. Well, don't turn into one of those men who gets lost after the dust settles. You're too damn stubborn for that. I smirked. I'll try. I wasn't lost. Not anymore. The bookstore became my regular spot. The coffee was good, the company better. Marissa had a way of reading people without prying, which made her easy to talk to. She didn't ask too many questions about the past, just made space for whatever came next. One evening, I was leaning against the counter, flipping through a book I wasn't really reading. Marissa was restocking shelves, glancing up every so often. You figure out where you're settling yet? I sipped my coffee, considering. Got a place lined up. Smaller. Less baggage. Good. She tapped a book spine into place. Some men don't know when to let go. I let go just fine. She gave me a look. You let go when you're done tearing things apart first. I smirked. You say that like it's a bad thing. Didn't say that. She set a book down, watching me. Just said that's how you work. Couldn't argue with that. The job at Lone Star turned out to be exactly what I needed. No desk work, no politics. Just problems that needed solving, people that needed watching. Some cases were clean, some weren't, but I never lost sleep over it. One night, Mike and Dalton showed up at my new place with beer and a busted radio. We sat on the porch, letting the night stretch out around us. You think you'll ever get married again? Mike asked, halfway through his third bottle. I scoffed. You think I got brain damage? Dalton chuckled. Nah, just making sure you're still sane. I smirked, leaned back in my chair. I got no interest in making the same mistake twice. Mike raised his beer. To lessons learned. We clinked bottles, let the moment settle. The night air was cool, the desert quiet. The past was dead, buried under the weight of bad decisions and consequences. I didn't feel angry anymore. Didn't feel cheated. I felt done. And that was all I needed.